Welcome to Jockonary. Today I'm going to be discussing That Guy Fae The Corries, which is the autobiography of Ronnie Browne, who is the only surviving member of the Corries at this point in time. The Corries are very significant figures in Scottish culture, and not least because they gave us our de facto national anthem, Flower of Scotland, which I just played for you badly on the melodica. But there's a lot more to their music than that. I believe the first time I heard the Corries was as a very young child visiting my grandpa in Aberlour. I have a distinct memory of sitting in his dark Aberlour townhouse with his Alsatian Bruno sitting on the seat next to me listening to the Corries. But it was a long time before I really came to appreciate their music, or folk music in general. And that is partly because when I was at school we had to sing the Rattling Bog, and I was forced to play the violin as well. And that gave me an abiding hatred of Scottish traditional music, which took me a long time to get over. So I think the lesson there is be careful what you push on your kids, because they will push back against you. But ironically, it's because of my own son that I've really come to appreciate the Corries at this point, because he was born with some kind of unusual attitude to music, possibly a hint of the Scottish cringe or something, but he would not let me or my wife sing to him. Even though my wife's got a very nice voice, he just wouldn't suffer it. So we would play him the Corries as lullabies, and he loved them, and he still loves them to this day.
Let go, boys. Let go, boys. We never run all together. And again.
Yeah, that's good.
And again. Here. Oh, boys, let go, boys, we never run all together. And again.
If you like. These days the Corries are probably mostly thought of as a duo, but when they began they were actually a trio plus a female Irish singer called Paddie Bell. So it was the Corrie folk trio and Paddie Bell. And the folk trio was Roy Williamson, Ronnie Browne and Bell Smith, who was another founding member. On the evening before the first night's performance, the name the Corrie folk trio and Paddie Bell was dreamed up. A corrie is a dip in the hillside, and it crops up in place names all over Scotland, such as the White Corries, Black Corries, Corrie Shallach, etc. It was in such dips in the hills that the Covenanters conducted their illicit conventicles, with guards posted on the surrounding hillsides. There was also a folk singer and folk song collector called Joe Corrie. It seemed to us that the word Corrie conjured up sights and sounds of Scotland, and so we chose it. No advertising had gone out in the name of the group, as it wouldn't have meant anything anyway, so we went out to face 8 people who'd only come in for coffee. However, they stayed for the next session and the next, and in fact everyone that evening, in spite of the songs being the same each time. That was the birth of our fairy story, because those same 8 people came back the next night, this time with friends, and they all stayed on for our 4 spots. By the end of the first week we were singing to a full house of 80 every night. They appeared on the BBC on the Hoot'nanny show as the resident house band in a folk club, along with lots of other guest musicians, which Ronnie talks about in his book. He's got some stories to say about these people. They appeared on the White Heather Club, and their sections on that would be performed on location around Scotland, at evocative locations according to wherever the music might be. So if they were performing the Braes of Killiecrankie, they would perform it at the Pass of Killiecrankie, for example. Over time it seems that they grew apart from Paddie Bell. It seems to have been a gradual drifting apart, and they just played with her less and less often. According to the book, it seems that she didn't really enjoy touring with them. The rigours of the road as a small outfit with mostly males, I'm not sure it was for her. But when it comes to Bill Smith, they just didn't get on with him. They were very argumentative, and it even came to blows a few times. And it culminated when Bill Smith left them high and dry, didn't turn up for a gig, didn't communicate, very unprofessional behaviour, so they elected to continue without him. And that was a hard decision to make, because Ronnie admits himself he wasn't the most accomplished musician. He was obviously a good singer, and he obviously had innate talent as well, because he was able to pick things up quite quickly, but he had to work pretty hard, I think, to make up for lost ground. Was Bill's failure to make an appearance for the engagement because of illness, or perhaps just the result of a heavy hangover, or was it a more sinister, deliberate attempt to show to Roy and me that we were nothing without him? We gave him the benefit of the doubt and decided to await an explanation from him the next day, and acknowledged the fact that other groups experienced the same kind of, shall I say, personality clashes. Over the next few days, during which time there was still no word from Mr. Bill Smith, our conversation crystallised into continuing to sing on our own. I picked up a guitar and a capo, the metal bar encased in rubber and elasticated to hold it firmly against a fret of the fingerboard, and I learned to play 3 chords. With the aid of the capo, those 3 basic chord shapes could be made to play in almost any key. This is a somewhat simplistic explanation of the principle, but it suited me down to the ground. I made a start I was practising with Roy on the day Bill finally made an appearance at Roy's front door. I suggested that perhaps it would be better if Roy the diplomat answered the summons, which he did. I heard Bill enter the hall, and with a light-hearted slap and rub of his hands he inquired smugly, "Okay guys, what's happening?" Harsh words passed back and forward after Roy explained our decision to carry on without him. As he slammed the front door shut behind him, Bill shouted, "Your group's In my opinion, the music of the Corries is quite underrated and underappreciated, even accounting for Flower of Scotland and its popularity. That was an original song, but they also performed a valuable service in keeping Scottish folk tradition alive and bringing songs to people's attention that might otherwise have been lost. And they were also quite creative in their arrangements and quite diverse in the type of music they would play. It was everything from comedy songs to really rich, atmospheric, evocative songs steeped in history. I hope I don't sound too big-headed when I say that we had become used to roofs being lifted at the end of our shows, because such popularity as we had achieved didn't go without detractors. Some people on the folk scene, club organisers and columnists, didn't entirely hold with our performances, thinking we should present a more serious blend of what they considered to be authentic, leaving the lighter and funnier material to what might be called the Tartan Brigade. By lighter I mean songs such as The Lass of Fyvie, Johnny Lad, The Wild Rover, Come O'er the Stream Charlie, and all songs referring to the Bonnie Prince. They didn't seem to think that an audience should be allowed to laugh. We disagreed, however, and thought that we'd found a perfect blend. Although some lighter material was certainly included and an amount of clowning was present, we also led a very mixed audience into the world of obscure and indeed forgotten folk music. I'll illustrate. Bill Hill wrote a hilarious parody of the old Frankie Lane hit Ghost Riders in the Sky, changing the words to the Teuchter that came fae Skye. It's not a true folk song, but my it is funny, and it never failed to have our audience of mums and dads and children, and even some folk club members who may have sneaked in disguise, shame on them, in stitches, clapping, foot stamping, laughing and singing the chorus. At the end of such a song we would invariably dim the lights, quietly change the guitars for, say, concertina and mandolin, and I would recite something along the lines of, "The unrelenting cruelties of the Duke of Cumberland spared neither age, sex nor condition, and Scotland for a while realised the prophecy of Paddie, which foretold that the time was nigh when her people might ride 50 miles through her hills and valleys and never see a reeking hoose nor hear a crowing cock." Into the silence that would descend we would sing the Highland Widows Lament, a true ballad from our Scottish troubled times, which starts, "Oh, I am come to the low country, ocha and ocha and ochree, without a penny in my purse to buy a meal to me." They sequenced their live shows quite carefully to lead people through peaks and troughs of emotion, to make them laugh and to make them cry. And I think that's why they were so successful and caught on so quickly, really. It's because they were able to engage the audience and people would sing along as well. Scottish traditional music, I think, is quite different in character to English folk music, generally speaking. It's got more in common with Irish music, obviously, through the Celtic tradition. But music transcends borders and there is cross-cultural pollination going on, so there are parallels to be found. An example of that would be a Dark Lochnagar, which the Corries have done a beautiful rendition of, and that song was actually written by an Englishman, Sir Henry Bishop. He wrote the tune, and Lord Byron wrote the words, so it just goes to show. And all this music also crossed the Atlantic and got absorbed into the American folk tradition, where it's continued to evolve in interesting ways. Before the days of recorded music and copyright enforcement, songs would be passed from musician to musician, probably mostly through the oral tradition, although no doubt some musicians could read and write notation. But the songs would evolve along the way. And if you go back and read some of the child ballads, for example, recorded by Francis James Child, who recorded songs from throughout the British Isles, you'll see dozens of different versions of the same song, and even sections of songs used in completely different songs, without any regard for who actually wrote it, and in most cases the original authors are lost to history. Robert Burns was also a great chronicler of Scottish music, and he published his in James Johnson's Scots Musical Museum compendiums, and Burns would not only record songs that he'd picked up, he would also write his own and then rewrite existing pieces of music. An example of that would be Green Grow the Rashes, which was apparently originally a satirical song about priests set to an entirely different piece of music, but Burns adapted the words and set it to a pre-existing tune whose origins are just lost to history, I think, but it was first written down in the 18th century. And Michael Mara did a really good live rendition of that, Green Grow the Rashes, on piano, which I would really strongly suggest you look up on YouTube if you're interested in this type of music. And the reason I'm speaking about the child ballads and Robert Burns is because I think the Corries were continuing in that tradition of keeping culture alive and keeping these songs moving forward and evolving, because the Corries were quite creative in their arrangements. They do a version of a ballad called Lord Gregory. Well, they've got a couple of different versions of this actually, but the one I'm talking about is on Peat Fire Flame album, where there's quite a lot of studio overdubbing, I believe. But it's got a very rich medieval sound to it. It evokes court minstrels, and it's an ancient ballad telling a tragic tale of Lord Gregory, whose mother intervenes in his love life to tragic ends. Part of what contributes to the medieval sound of that rendition is this drone noise, which I suspect must be being made by one of their Combolin instruments. But if you know better, leave a comment down below. It sounds almost like a hurdy-gurdy, but I have to believe it was one of the Combolins. And these were unique instruments which were made by Roy Williamson. They played a lot of different instruments and they got fed up carrying them all around with them. So they decided to combine some of them into these two unique instruments, which I believe were supposed to go into mass production but never did. And they were very fragile instruments too, because they were under so much tension, so many strings. But the joke was that they didn't replace any instruments, they just added two more. One night, when we were particularly early in getting back to Edinburgh, Lee succumbed to the temptation of one wee drink and a chat to his pals before unpacking and storing the instruments. The inevitable happened. Someone who had probably cased his habits was around, the van was broken into, and every instrument stolen, including the priceless, unique Combolins built by Roy. When Lee got back to the van and discovered the theft, he immediately phoned me. His one wee drink with his pals must have extended to 2 or 3, because it was 2:30 in the morning when he called. I was in no condition to hit the roof because I too had sampled a few wee drinks before going to bed, but I had to phone the police. It was suggested that I go early next morning to the station at the end of Mayfield Road, where nowadays stands the Braidburn Inn, and leave descriptions. This done, Roy and I frantically shopped round Edinburgh for replacements where possible, at the same time wondering what we could sing without our big guns, the Combolins. After the next 2 nights' concerts, I was again in bed when I received another late night call. This one was neither from Lee nor the police, but from a man who was obviously a fence. In the most pleasant of tones, he told me he was sorry he hadn't been able to get all the instruments back, but they had recovered the big green cases that housed the Combolins and laid them in a back green in the Craigmillar area, not far from Mayfield Road. Even the densest thief would realise they couldn't possibly offload them, with only 2 in existence and associated with nobody but the Corries. He explained that he was a fan and was delighted to return them to us. In my excitement and relief, and it could also have been something to do with the wee drinks I'd swallowed, I thanked him politely and asked his name. He showed remarkable presence of mind by saying, "Oh, you're not going to catch me that way, Ronnie." I couldn't help but smile. I put the phone down and called the police, saying that I was on my way to pick up the instruments. No, I was told, don't go on your own. Come down to the station and a couple of constables will go with you. This I did, and while we were on the way to the back green, they explained what should have been obvious, that this could perhaps be a ruse to get me on my own and rob me. Of course they were right. They also said when we arrived I should look around carefully. I'd probably notice every curtain was slightly drawn to watch our progress towards the instruments. Again, they were right. I told them I would accept the responsibility of opening the cases lest they were booby-trapped. As it happened, they weren't, and I took the instruments home, thankfully undamaged. To this day, when I drive through Craigmillar, I imagine some of the local villains smiling and saying to themselves, I remember him, that guy for the Corries. Ronnie's book leaves little doubt that Roy Williamson was the most accomplished musician in the group and probably the real driving force behind them too. To be honest, it doesn't really contain a lot of the sort of information that I personally was hoping for, as Ronnie's not really interested in what goes on in the studio, and he doesn't talk a lot about the music other than Flower of Scotland. I would have liked to have heard more about the history of the music and why they chose the tunes that they did and why they adapted them the way that they did. He doesn't really go into that sort of thing at all. He's obviously quite passionate about the visual arts too. He's a portrait painter. And he does talk at length about a portrait he did for James Douglas Hamilton of the Black Douglas, which I found really interesting because he talks a lot about the history and the symbolism and some of the compositional aspects of the painting. I would have liked to have heard more of that sort of thing concerning the music as well. Roy Williamson's daughter Karen did write a book which I haven't yet read, but I'm going to have to read that one to see if it contains more of the sort of information I'm looking for, really. Ronnie's book is perfectly fine as a history of his life, a story of his life, but the Corries are only a part of his life, it's not his whole life. So there's a large section at the beginning which I found quite interesting where he's talking about growing up in Edinburgh in the first half of the 20th century, which gives you a real window into that world and what it must have been like at that time. Ronnie does talk a lot about the business side of the music industry, how much money they made and what they spent it on. So there's a lot to do with property renovation and foreign travel. And that stuff personally just wasn't of interest to me, I'm afraid, but it's not to disparage Ronnie, it's his story. But if you're looking for wild rock and roll stories, this is not the book for you. There's also surprisingly little about politics in this book. Perhaps Ronnie just likes to play his cards a bit close to his chest. Obviously, given the nature of the music they performed, there's a bit of allusion to politics, but given that this book came out in 2015, a year after the Scottish independence referendum, it's perhaps surprising. Or maybe he was upset by the result and didn't want to talk about it, I don't know. I risk shattering the vision you might have of a television and concert star forever dining in large, plush, expensive joints, making a point of being seen and photographed for the gossip columns. That wasn't for us. Risking another hammer blow, I must tell you that we went on to meet another 3 couples at the Conservative Club in Portobello. A hammer blow indeed. I'll give Ronnie the benefit of the doubt there because his sense of humour can be a bit inscrutable at times. It's not always exactly clear what he means, at least not to me. To return to Flower of Scotland, the way that caught on is quite a nice story, so I'll read it in Ronnie's words for you. Bill Hogg, then the secretary of the SRU, explained that for the past 2 seasons internationals, the team had adopted the habit of singing Flower of Scotland under their breath when God Save the Queen was being played before the kick-off. They'd grown tired of this surreptitious practice and wanted Flower of Scotland to be played as their anthem. Could they have permission to do so? I said no permission was required and both Roy and I would be over the moon if they went ahead. Bill also told me that the Corries' recording of Flower of Scotland was always played on the bus, taking the players from their hotel to Murrayfield, and it was timed to end just as the bus stopped inside the stadium and the players sang along the way. Since Roy was now in a much reduced condition at home, I took it on myself to agree that the first verse should certainly be played before the games as our anthem. I phoned this news to Roy, and I'll leave you your imagination to think what his reaction was. It was played for the first time ever as Scottish National Anthem at the first game of the championship at Murrayfield against France. I'm told that Roy was well enough to watch on television and he had a broad smile on his face. Not long afterwards, I was again summoned to Bill Hogg's office where I was told that 2 weeks after the French game, when we played Wales in Cardiff, David Soul and his team noticed the Welsh anthem was twice as long as ours. What could we do about it? Again, I had to take it on myself to decide whether to add the second or third verse. I chose the third since his opening lines of "Those days are past now, and in the past they must remain" have a more conciliatory feeling. Then again, when you think about it, what should a national anthem be but fiercely patriotic, especially sung at a rugby match where the combatants are steeling themselves to knock 7 bells out of each other? At this point, let me make something clear. Flower of Scotland is constantly criticised as being anti-English, but what could be more anti-Scottish than God Save the Queen, which we as the Scottish nation have been forced to sing over many years? Let me give you the words of one of that song's verses. God grant that Marshal Wade may by thy mighty aid victory bring. May he sedition hush and like a torrent rush rebellious Scots to crush. God save the King. When Flower of Scotland was aired during that Five Nations, it came under such fierce criticism that one of our most widely read national weekly newspapers conducted a poll naming other contenders for an anthem, songs such as Scotland the Brave and others which had been rolling around in the national collective psyche for a lot longer than Flower of Scotland. The resulting 31% in favour of Roy's song was streets ahead of anything else. Not long afterwards, Ernie Walker of the SFA announced that a forthcoming football international, Scotland's anthem would be Scotland the Brave. Immediately the editor got on the phone to ask Ernie if he hadn't read about the poll. What did Ernie think was going to happen when the band struck up singing Scotland the Brave? The fans would be singing Flower of Scotland. To which Ernie replied, I don't know, because I'll be singing Flower of Scotland as well. It's nice that Roy Williamson lived long enough to hear Flower of Scotland gaining traction as the unofficial national anthem and hear it being performed in public at these sporting events. It's clear that his untimely death affected Ronnie Browne greatly, understandably. He tried to sustain a solo singing career after that for a few years, but I think he found it too upsetting and he didn't want to take on another singing partner, so that was effectively the end of his musical career. But he's obviously got other talents as well. That's not the end of his story. Willie is now a head teacher, and another of his interests is the work of Robert Burns, so much so that he hosts a small Burns supper in his home every year with just a few chosen guests. I have been one of those guests on quite a few occasions. At first when I was invited, Willie would ask me to sing, but I always said no, that I don't sing anymore. He now doesn't ask, accepting that I will say no. When the invitation arrived last year, I said to Lauren that this time I would surprise him with a couple of songs, and proceeded to practice to get my voice back in shape. Do you know, even in practice I can't get through without starting to weep. This is not just in sentimental songs, but in any song. To think that during all those years of singing, of harnessing emotion to wring it out of an audience, and I've seen evidence of it in the open shedding of tears in a theatre, I can't now control it. It's a strange phenomenon to have to accept. That is why, after being accorded the honour of singing Flower of Scotland for our Commonwealth Games athletes, a request I couldn't refuse, I realised that after nearly breaking down once more, I should not try to sing again. He does make a few references to YouTube clips, so he obviously doesn't mind some of the Corrie stuff being on YouTube, and I hope he won't mind me using some of it in this video for illustrative purposes, under fair dealing copyright law of course. But he says that the best Corrie's performance is on YouTube, and it's actually by the Curries, which is Rikki, Fulton and Gregor Fisher taking the mickey out of the Corries. So I'll put a link to that down below, plus some other recommendations, and you can look that up at your leisure. To return to my pick for Scottish National Anthem, well, I'm quite happy with Flower of Scotland, honestly. I do think it's a good choice. I like the fact that it's got some unusual timing. It's apparently quite hard to time along with a marching band, but crowds seem to have no problem singing it. It's got a kind of emotive flow to it that I think is quite appropriate. But I do think there's something to be said for Harmless by Michael Mara as an anthem, because if we're to be an independent country, we should be thinking about what kind of message we're projecting to the world. And I think Harmless, Never Nae Bother for Me is a good thing to aspire to in these dark times. Well, that's that Guy Fae The Corries. Not quite the book I was hoping for, but an interesting read nonetheless. I will have to read Karen Williamson's book next. Thank you for watching.
I will go, I will go.